Okay. So Helen, if you'd like to lead off and I'll do the housekeeping slide.
Okay, so you're all very welcome to this talk. This series of talks have been running since October and it's going to continue on to next summer. And I suppose what we're really trying to do is look at different aspects of grief and loss that might be helpful to people who are living with grief and loss in their lives. So I'm Helen Greally. I work here as a psychologist in Cancer Care West, and I have a huge interest in grief and loss and have had that for many years and carried out some research on the topic back in the 1990s. And today I'm just going to share with you really the kind of our thoughts about what we learned about grief and loss from all the research we've done, and kind of what our thinking today is about how people grieve and why they grieve the way they do. So basically, that's kind of what today's talk is going to be about. I'm going to let Mary Kate just take you through some housekeeping now, and then we'll kick off the talk proper.
Okay, can you move the slide forward for me there, Helen? Maybe 2 slides, I think. Yeah, there's the housekeeping slide. So this is really just to let everybody know that this piece is being recorded and then will be uploaded so that even if you missed today or you want to go back to it later on, it's there for you. We ask that everybody respects that everybody is bringing their own experience to today's event. And if somebody is speaking, please try to listen and not interrupt while they're speaking. If someone does share their story, please remember that's their story, just like your story is your story, and please don't be sharing it afterwards. We ask that you don't try to fix, advise, or rescue people today. Once the recording is stopped, and we will let you know that, we would ask, if possible, that your cameras are turned on, just so that we can see each other. And if you want to speak, either raise your hand and then turn on your microphone. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay not to ask questions. It's also okay to share or not share. There's no pressure on you this morning, but obviously the more you can interact, sometimes the more you get out of the event. Next month's Grief Talk session will be happening on the second Tuesday, the 12th of December at 10 a.m. The topic is grieving at Christmas, and I will be presenting on that. And again, if you want to register, just simply go to the Cancer Care West website and register just like you did for this morning's event. So I'm going to hand back again now to yourself, Helen.
Okay, thanks, Mary Kate.
Okay.
So the title of our talk today is From Letting Go to Continuing Bonds. Our understanding of bereavement has changed in the last 3 decades. And today's talk is really focused on looking at kind of what we know about grief from research and theories that have been written over the last, I suppose, 30 or 40 years. And we know that grief and loss is, we know that bereavement as a life event is one of the most challenging things that happens to any of us. And we also know it's common to all of us that it has happened already, it will happen again. That loss and grief are a real part of our lives. And how we navigate that and how we manage it is really important in terms of our well-being. So it's just really, that's what I'm going to talk about today. It's going to be quite focused on kind of what we actually know. I often think that, like, I've spent the last 40 years plus working with people who are grieving. And I suppose one of the things that I think is most difficult for grieving people is when other people tell them how to grieve or what they should or should not be doing. And often that's based on their own experiences, because we all have our own grief experiences and we think that what works for us would work for other people. And that's not really the case. Grief is very individual and unique to the person experiencing it. So I suppose we need to be clear about, that what I'm saying today is based on research and evidence. And that's really important, because we didn't just pluck it out of the sky. We actually know this is real, because we've researched around the world, have talked to grieving people to find out what it's like for them to be grieving. And from that, we can draw general guidelines about what might help or not help us in this situation. So I suppose just to be very clear, today I'm talking about bereavement that comes about through the death of somebody we love. And so that's the kind of loss I'm focusing on, not other kinds of losses. And life is full of losses. Our very first loss actually is when we come out of the womb, because we're in a nice little cocoon in there, very safe and secure, and then you've got to come out into the world. And that's our first real change in terms of having to adapt to a new set of circumstances. So for loss is part of our life from the time we're born, and it continues to be part of our life right throughout our lifespan. But really what I'm talking about today is the loss that we experience through the death of somebody we love. And because loss is such a part of life and part of the life cycle, I guess a lot of researchers and clinicians and psychologists and counselors and psychotherapists around the world have been searching for a long time to find out, why do we grieve the way we do grieve? Why do we grieve for the length of time we grieve for? What are the things that really influence our grief responses? And then how do we actually go about helping people? And the reality is that about 66% of all grieving people actually do not require counselling or psychotherapy or even group support. They need good basic knowledge, but they actually get through their grief on their own with good support, maybe from the people around them, from their own kind of understanding of what happened to them. But there's a core group of about a third of all grieving people who, for whatever reason, do struggle to adapt to their loss over time. And that's really the kind of, they're the people who are really interested in kind of making sure that they know there's research, there's support there for them. And these people might really struggle with their loss for a variety of reasons. So I guess that's what the focus has been. How do we find out why people struggle the way they do, and who are those people? So that's really what we've been kind of trying to get to for a long time. Sorry. So I suppose it's kind of fair to say that in the early 1900s and in the early 1900s, so around 1920, 1930, people such as Sigmund, whom you've all probably heard of, very famous psychoanalyst and psychiatrist who was working in this area, really kind of looked at the idea that what happens to people when they grieve. And the reason he was interested in that is because he had one client who was struggling a lot with her grief. And Freud decided or thought that, the reason she was grieving, the reason that she was presenting as being depressed was because she had unresolved grief. So the idea of unresolved grief or not getting over grief has been of interest for all of the last century and also into this one. And the early writers around grief, you've all probably heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, but she talked a lot about the stages of grief, and that got a lot of traction in the literature because it's very handy. You go through 5 stages of grief and you come out the other side and you're more or less meant to be like you were before it all happened. And when I was working for us as a psychologist back in the 1980s, we really bought into this theory, and we thought, okay, well, this is actually what happens. You go through these stages, stages such as shock, denial, emotional venting, and then you get to a state of resolution and acceptance. But in fact, our clients were telling us, this is not what grief is like for me at all. I actually don't want to say goodbye to the person who died. I want to keep them in my life in some way. And so researchers and clinicians around the world really started to talk to each other about the fact that the clients they were working with didn't fit into these neat stages. And so that's why we've done a lot of research over the last 20, 30, 40 years to try and find out, well, what does actually happen to people when they're grieving? So the idea was, in the stage theories, was that we all respond to the grief in the same way, and we go through 4 or 5 stages, and then we come out the other side and more or less go back to normal. And that is the case for a lot of people. That actually is what happens to them. But for the core group of people who really struggle with their grief, that doesn't fit into any package. So we really start to think about, like, what is grief like for people? And I suppose what I really want to say to you this morning is that the significance of any loss event, so anything we experience in life as a loss, is comprised of lots of different factors. The kind of relationship we have with the person who died, the person who's grieving, like, are they independent people, or are they anxiously attached to the person who died? Do they believe, I can't live without this person, and therefore their grief is very difficult for them? And also, what stage in my life am I at when this happens to me? So am I just married? Am I just retired? Did I just have a baby? What are the things that's happening to me so that's going to actually influence how I grieve? So what I'm really trying to say is grief doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens as part of our lifespan. And we have to bring all those factors into account to understand, that my grief might be influenced by all those things. And also a lot of other factors, like, what's my level of social support? Have I good friends that I can talk to? Have I 2 or 3 good friends? Not 50. We don't need lots of people to support us. We need a core group of people that will be there for us when we really need them. Am I the kind of person that maybe resorts to alcohol or drugs to kind of cope with strong feelings? And so, like, have I a tendency to kind of maybe depend on other, things that may become issues in themselves for me? So lots of contributing factors that influence the way I grieve. And I suppose because we work in the cancer service, we're acutely aware that a lot of people we work with who are grieving would have come through an illness with the person they love, and they knew that person maybe wasn't going to make it. And so the fact that they've lived with the kind of reality of a terminal illness for a length of time also influences our response to loss. If you pick up any book on grief and loss, you may come across the term anticipatory grief. And that is really the grieving we do before somebody dies, when we know somebody's very ill. And even though that's protective in some ways, there's kind of a myth out there that if you know someone's going to die, you're kind of better off, or grief is easier. That is not true at all, in my experience. I think that brings its own issues with it. Because, for example, if you're caring for someone who's sick for a long period of time, it starts to have an impact on your own health and how your own coping. And also, it's not just like somebody lives with a terminal illness for 6 months, it's how you use that time. So many times in our work here, we will come across people who say, like, I didn't use that time as well as I might have. I didn't talk about the things I wanted to talk about. And now they've died and I'm never going to get a chance to say it to them. And so there can be lots of stuff around knowing someone's dying that's difficult in itself. So even though it can be protective for some people, for other people, it actually can be an issue. So I want to talk for a second today about, I try and include this in all my talks because I think it's really important. So one of the big things that happens when we're grieving is that, or when we're bereaved, is that we realize we've been living our lives by core assumptions. And that's one of the major and overriding tasks in adapting to loss. So what is lost in bereavement? What assumptions do we lose? Will we lose predictability because the world did not turn out the way maybe we thought it would? We lose control because we all think we have control over our lives, but in fact, there are some things we can't control, like illness sometimes, and when somebody dies. And we lose the idea of permanence. Even though we know people have died before us, like I know that my parents have died, I know my sister and my brother have died, and that's all true. But I still have kind of in this cocoon where I think, like, I live forever. And the people I love will live forever, even though I know they won't. They're really challenged when somebody dies. And so it can be very difficult to adapt for that reason. And I really say to you today, just in terms of kind of giving advice, I suppose, is that if you don't address the issue of how your assumptions have to change, then you can really get stuck in grief. So you can't make sense of the loss if you don't let go. So, for instance, I worked with a woman once whose husband died from cancer, and she absolutely she felt she was a very helpless person, and she always believed, and I think her husband probably believed it as well, that she would die first because that would be easier on her because she wouldn't have to cope with the grief and loss. And her husband died in the end from a cancer related illness, and she was really bereft of him, obviously, and he was a big support in her life, and she really loved him. But what really got to her was that the assumptions by which she lived her life, that he would live after her, and he would in fact be the one who was bereaved. And set up her whole life around that belief system, was really challenged in when she was left on her own because her husband had died. I think it can be very difficult to kind of do these, to kind of adapt to that. When we're grieving and when somebody we love dies, we don't just lose the person, we lose lots of other things about ourselves as well, rules by which we lived our life, assumptions we make, our support system. Like, grief is never just one loss, it's lots of different losses made up in different ways. And and the other thing I want to talk about today, just in terms of kind of research, is that how we interpret what happens around us, it makes a big difference in the bereavement response. So, for example, we would work with a lot of people here who are grieving, and they would often look for signs from the person who died, that they reminded them or just still part of their lives. And people would say, like, if a robin comes on the windowsill. I worked with a man once, and his wife died, and he got a phone call from the hospital, said she was very poorly, and he drove into Galway City. And when he got to the car park in the hospital, there was a robin on the tree when he got out of the car, and he said to himself, "That's Mary, she's died now." And when he went in, the nurse said she just died. And when he drove back out home later on that evening, there was a robin on his windowsill, and he felt, that's the same robin. And that's Mary saying, I'm still with you, and I'll be here for a while. And the robin hung around the house for about 6 months, and then one day just disappeared. Now, he chose to interpret that as, this is my wife protecting me and staying with me because she knows I can't do it on my own. So I think it's really kind of important to realize that he chose to interpret that was very protective for him. But then somebody else might say, that's just coincidence, it means nothing. So how we interpret what happens really influences our grief and loss response. And it's important to, some people think, that's not logical, it's not scientific. But if that works for you, if that's how you choose to think about, what happens in your life afterwards, people would often say, like, when good things happen, that's that person minding me because I feel they're still part of my life. And that's why my title of my talk is From Letting Go to Continuing Bonds, because this idea of still having a relationship with the person, even though they're dead, is really, really important. So I suppose just to say what the early theories taught us, and these are the ones that are no longer particularly popular in scientific literature, but they taught us that grief happens in a series of stages, particularly including an end stage of recovery, that everybody grieves in the same way, which we know clearly is not true, that applies to everybody in a linear fashion. So it's like a stages of a cycle race, where you start with stage 1 and you end with stage 5 or 6 or 20. That everyone goes through it in the same way, and we know that's not true, because in fact people say all the time, I go back and forth in my grief, it's like a seesaw, and some days I wake up and I think, oh, it's not that bad actually, I'm okay, and then an hour or two later I've fallen apart. And we know that's what grief is like. It can be overwhelming, it can be all encompassing, it can be very hard to manage it. So it doesn't happen in that way, the way that the early theories talked about. In the past, grief was seen as a negative life event. What I mean by that is that, like, it was really challenging, and of course it is very challenging. But a lot of people we work with that I've met over the years have told me very clearly that, in fact, even though they're really sad this person left their lives, they've learned something about themselves in the landscape of grief in that journey. Maybe they've learned that they were stronger than they thought they were. Maybe they learned that they were more resourceful than they thought they were. Maybe they learned that the relationship was so stable and so good for them that in fact it's been protective now that the person has died. So for a lot of people, it's in a very negative life event initially, but over time, people who can adapt to their loss tend to learn something from them about themselves from that grief event. And obviously the other thing was that the griever completes the stages and lets go of the person who died. And this idea of letting go has become very controversial, because in fact now we think we don't let go, we hold on to people in some way, depending on whether it's healthy or not. So over time, psychologists, counsellors, clinicians realised that this formulation did not accurately or adequately reflect what grievers are feeling or thinking. So I'm just going to share a story from my own work. So when I was working in the 1980s, one of the things we used to do quite a lot was use a thing called the empty chair. And it's a very helpful model to get people maybe to look at unresolved issues in their life. So you imagine the person that's died is sitting in the empty chair, and you can talk to them back and forth, and you might have a good idea of what they'd say back to you. You have this kind of dialogue with the person even though they've died. And that's really helpful to look at unresolved issues. But what we were using the empty chair for was getting people to say goodbye and let go. And a lot of clients have said to me over the years, I don't really want to let go of this person. I want to hold on to them. I want them to be part of my life today. And this idea of letting go, this very like kind of medical model of grief, where you've got to finish the grief stages, really was not helpful to people who were grieving. So for that reason, we've really kind of worked differently now. We still use the empty chair, but in a different way to saying goodbye. So the prevailing models of grief, the ones I've just talked about, the stages, the model, letting go, the say goodbye, just didn't seem to kind of really be helpful to the people we were working with. And that's what's the biggest driver of why change came about, why people started to do research in grief and loss over the last 20 or 30 years. So the primary problem with the early stage theories is that they were unable to account for why people grieve differently. So for example, if you have a group of 5 siblings and their parent dies, and they come from a fairly intact family, and they had a good relationship with their parent who died, they have a good relationship with the other parent. Why is it that even for those 5 siblings from the same family, they will all grieve slightly differently? And of course, the ones we look out for are the ones that grieve very differently. But the reality is grief is very individual and unique to the person who's experiencing it. And what happened before was, when we were kind of following the stages, was that we were saying, if you don't conform to the stages, there's something wrong with your grief. And this is not true, because in fact, individual responses to loss are really, really important. There is no right way to grieve. There's no right length of time to grieve for. It's all very much about me, my story, and what happened to me. So beginning in the late 1980s, researchers such as Margaret Strebe, very well-known people in the area, particularly Robert Niemeyer and Dennis Class, really started to question, well, do these early theories, do they really work for us at all? Are they actually reflecting what we're hearing from our clients? And the answer was no. And since that time, we've changed the way we think about grief and loss. We've shifted away from kind of purely intrapersonal, like, so what's going on within me, to more interpersonal, what's going on around me, so my support circle. Purely from kind of looking at a kind of a disease and an illness to, like, what are the factors biologically, psychologically, socially that actually influence my grief response? So do I have good social support? Have I got a good level of attachment? Am I have a kind of a stable personality? What's my own physical health like? Lots of factors that influence people. And then we moved away from just saying what happens, so describing all things that happens in grief, to like, what are the factors that interfere with them? So like, what do I have, even things like when I did my research on bereavement, one of the things that kind of astonished me were two things really. One was that people who were better off had better outcomes because they didn't have to worry about money. Now, money doesn't fix grief in any way, shape, or form, but in fact, it's one less thing to worry about. It's one less stress to worry about. And in fact, the other thing that I found out from my research was that people who had strong spiritual beliefs, people who believed in an afterlife, or believed they would meet the person who died again, or believed that was somebody higher than them pulling all the strings, that those people tend to have better outcomes as well. So I suppose there are some things, and obviously that's in the Irish culture, which is different to other cultures. So we have to be also really aware of the fact that Ireland now being a multicultural country, we have lots of different ways of grieving that people are kind of bringing with them from their own cultures, and we have to be very respectful of that as well. So in the 1980s or 1990s, we've changed our models, and we've looked at things like stress and coping. So grief is a stressful life event. It is a very stressful life event. It's the most stressful life event that probably happens to all of us. And back in 1967, which is a long time ago now, there was a scale devised by a psychologist called the Holmes-Rahe scale of stressful life events. And what they found was they kind of rated what were the most stressful life events that we meet in our lives. And at that time, the death of a spouse was the most stressful life event, followed by the death of a child. I'm not sure I buy into that now, but that's what they found. And they found even things like Christmas is really stressful. So the death of a spouse would have a rating of 100. Christmas would have something like 60, something like 25. So I think that it's really important that like, and at its core, bereavement is a stressful life event. It requires a lot of coping. We have models like the dual process model, just putting these out there that there really are theories that have these names. And dual process is all about treating grief like a kind of a seesaw. And sometimes you're really stuck in the grief and you're really thinking about the person who died and the kind of funeral it was, and what they said and what they didn't say. And sometimes you've got to live in the present, where you've got to get the dinner ready and you've got to pay the bills and you've got to make sure that there's money in the account, for example. So, and dual process all about we go back and forth. They call this oscillation. And oscillation really is the back and forth between grieving and being really in the throes of grief, and then actually functioning in the present day world. And grief does require that idea of going back and forth. We've got continuing bonds, which obviously is one of the most influential models today. And this is the idea that even when someone dies and is physically no longer in our lives, we still we carry around a representation of them in our memory. They're very much part of who we are today. They often influence what we do in our present life. So continuing bonds is really important, and it's got a lot of traction and kind of got a lot of press in more recent years. And then meaning making. And meaning making is really about how do you make sense of the loss? So I'll go back to the assumptions. So if, for example, you're with somebody for a long time, it's very hard to make sense of some losses. So, for example, the loss of a child, the death of a child, is one of the most difficult losses to make sense of. It's very hard. What I mean by making sense is fitting it into your framework of beliefs. So, for example, if you believe in an all-powerful, all-loving God, and then suddenly you have this major life event where your child dies or your partner dies or somebody you're really, really attached to dies, and so it's like, how could a good God do that to me? How did that happen to me? And that can really challenge very profound beliefs that we have. So what you've got to do when you're grieving is really try to make sense of these events that happen to us, and they don't seem to fit into any kind of framework. And so meaning making and continuing bonds is really important, because if we do manage to make sense of it, and we do manage to still have some kind of bond with the person who died, then that's maybe really helpful for us going forward. So continuing bonds and making have got a lot of traction in the literature over the last 20 years in particular. So what do the newer theories tell us? And I suppose this is really what I wanted to impart today to all of you. So they tell us, first of all, that the grief response is not universal to everybody. Not everybody responds the same way. So one of my neighbours, my next door neighbour, one of their parents died 3 weeks ago, and he was well into his 90s. And anyway, we were away when the funeral happened, so we put out a card to the house, a mass card to the house. When we came back, and we said we were very sorry it happened. And the answer that we got, and it was in some ways it's kind of, I suppose it's amazing. The lady said to me, "Well, sure, it was time for him. He was 97. He had a good life. He had a great death. He had all his children around him. We're not really that sad." And I just think, like, that's so empowering in some ways. But it's like, it just really highlights the fact that she was like that about that loss, because it was normal. It's really what we expect. Our parents died before us. When we get older, we're all going to die anyway. It doesn't, that grief response would be very different if somebody had died in your life to whom she had a different kind of relationship. If one of her children or her partner had died, she wouldn't have had that response. So I suppose it's just that grief is completely individual and it depends on so many factors. Even when grief is prolonged, so nowadays in the literature we use the word prolonged grief for grief that goes on longer than expected. But I would be saying to you that even if grief goes on 3, 4, or 5 years, that is not in any way indicative of a complicated grief response necessarily, because actually we always grieve. We grieve the day we die from people died that we really loved. I don't mean we grieve intensely that we're falling apart or we can't do our work or we can't function, but we would have times in the day or times in the week where we really get overwhelmed with it, when like it just like, God, I wish just didn't happen to me. And that's prolonged grief, but it's not prolonged grief that's intense. The grief that's really intense, that you can't function at all, that's what we watch out for in terms of like, do you need more support than you're getting? And letting go of the person who dies, so going right back to Sigmund Freud that I talked about a minute ago, severing our bonds or saying goodbye to people is not necessary for healthy grief. And in fact, maintaining that bond may be a healthy response in some ways. So my father died in 1979, and my mother died in 1986. And every summer I go back down to West Clare where they were from, and I kind of do a pilgrimage. I'm not saying I'm doing that, but I just feel like that connects with them in some way or other. And so I think it's really important to realize that this is a healthy thing to do, but I'm not dwelling on it. So we don't need to let go of people completely. I would still say to myself sometimes, if my mother or father were here today, what would they say to me about this? And they've missed lots of big milestones in my life. They've missed my children, they missed that I got married, because they died quite young. So I think it's just really, I suppose, important to realize this, that like they're still part of my life, even though they're not physically here. And we carry them with us in our memory. And then the very important thing that's happened more recently is that there is a big role for resilience. So how are you resilient? What do you have in your tool bag that you can take out and really, that you can really kind of support you in your grief? So there's a very well-known psychologist who lives in Australia, and her daughter was killed in a very bad road traffic accident a number of years ago. And she fell apart completely, according to her own words. She really couldn't cope. And she said it was just like, she came to a point in her grief where she said, can I go on without my daughter? Can I live in the world without her? And part of her wanted to do that, another part of her just wanted to lie down and die herself. And she just said, like, I had to be flexible about how I manage this. So the word being flexible is really, really important. Have we flexibility in our lives? Can we adapt over time? And resilience, we all have things we can rely on to help us get through really tough times sometimes. And one of the bits of research we're really looking at now is that, in fact, resilience and the ability to be flexible is really important in our grief response. So the other things that come out of the contemporary theories are making sense. So how do you fit it into your framework of beliefs? And that's why people who have strong spiritual beliefs, who believe in an afterlife, believe in, that something there after we die, often that's very supportive and kind of comforting, because the idea that I might meet this person that's gone on my life again, or to sit around somewhere, the role of the continuing bond, which I've taught you about, that it's a process that happens over time, so that like we adapt over time. Your grief on day one will be very different to the grief you experience 2 or 3 years later. And what we're really looking for is that gradually over time, the grief becomes more manageable, and the feelings when they come up are not as intense. They're really kind of two ways that we kind of assess whether somebody's grief is kind of at a level that's not okay for them. And then, so the intensity of the feelings, how strong are my feelings, and how long have they been there? They're really important in terms of identifying risk. So if somebody came and see me 5 years after the death of someone they loved, and they said they hadn't gone back to work, that they really felt they had no interest in anything, that they were, that life had lost all its meaning, I would certainly be worried about that person, because I would say this is too long away from the grief event to be still having these really strong feelings. So that's often what we're trying to ask people to watch out for. Like, how strong are your feelings? How often do they come? And when they come, how long do they last? So I suppose just want to put in some notes of caution. It's very important to realise one size does not fit all in grief. For some people, the stages of grief are like they're an answer to prayer. Because people like being, if I go into this kind of manualized way of grieving, if I follow the stages and they work for me, that's great. There's no right way to grieve. So for a lot of people, the stages of grief help them to feel like they're in control. But what's really important, if that works for you, it may not work for other people. So I think it's just to really realise that like one size does not fit all in grief. We all have our own unique ways of grieving, and we need to be allowed to do that. And I really believe this sincerely. The biggest factor in grief is giving people time to grieve. We want to rush through everything nowadays. You know, we rush children through their childhood. We expose them to stuff far too early on in their lives. We rush people to, you know, to all kinds of life events. We're videoing stuff to death and recording it. But in fact, time is a great healer in grief. And it's not time, it's not the passage of time, it's how you use it. So to use it in a way that's healthy for you, that's really the question. And so time, giving yourself time to grieve, to reflect, to think about that person, see how you're going to carry them on with you in your life in a way that's healthy for you, is really, really important. So I suppose the other thing that's common across all the models, whether the older models or the newer ones, is that we all know what grief is like. We know it's full of sadness, frustration, sometimes anger, sometimes guilt, sometimes relief. One of the most common features probably that we come across here is that when people have been, when somebody's loved person has been sick for a long time, and then the relief comes that they're no longer suffering. That's one of the most common phrases that I hear here, is that like, I really miss them, but I'm glad they're suffering, because they really suffer with their illness. And cancer does that to people. And even though we've got really good at pain management and managing all that stuff, nonetheless, the kind of length of time somebody's sick with cancer can really influence how people adapt to it afterwards. That I would say that it's reasonable to say that all grief needs some kind of confrontation with the reality of the loss. We have to know somebody has died. We have to be aware of it, because to be able to make sense of it, we have to be aware it's happened. And one of the most key things is that the relationship with the person who died is really important. So if I was, if I'm married to somebody and I'm anxiously attached to them, in other words, I can't function without this person, I can't let them leave me, I can't cope if they're not here, it's fairly certain that if that person dies for some reason, then I will really struggle, because I feel very bereft of them in my life. So often, like, what kind of relationship did you have with the person who died? Did you get to say goodbye to them? Did you say everything you wanted to say? Did you have the funeral the way you wanted it? And so on. All those questions are really important. So I suppose the way we think about grief nowadays is that we've gone away from stage models to some extent. We're really tracking smaller numbers of grieving people over longer periods of time. Because one thing we can say about grief is it changes over time, so we need to know what that change is. And there's new concepts such as making sense of the loss. That means, how do I fit it into my framework of beliefs about myself and the world? What resilience do I have? What flexibility do I have? And forming a new identity, an identity where we know the person has died, we're still living in the world ourselves. And then very famous writer now on grief and loss is a man called George Bernard, who's based in the States, and he really has big emphasis on flexibility. So it's a bit like, I know it was last year, the day before, time goes by so fast, but a tanker got stuck in the Suez Canal. You probably all remember that, and they had real difficulty getting it out there and turning around. The bigger your tanker of grief, the more difficult it is to turn it around. It's easier to turn around a yacht than it is a tanker, an oil tanker. So how flexible can you be in your grief? How open are you to being flexible? That we no longer think about people who grieve in their own way, being abnormal or wrong in some way, that like there is no right way to grieve. Sometimes a good example of this is that some people go to the grave every single day, some people never go, and most people are in between. There's no right way to be. It's whatever works for you. It's what's good for you. I focus on continuing on ways of looking at how do I still have a relationship with the person who died. I bet for all of those in the talk today, there are times you say, when something happens, you have to say, what would that person say to me if they were here? That's how you continue your relationship. It's not that you're pretending they're still in the room with you, or that you can talk to them, but you have a good idea, if you know them well, what they would do or say. A narrative model of grieving, what I mean by that is that telling and retelling your story is really important. And I think a concern that some of our clients have here is that when they come in to talk about their grief and loss, they're often telling the same story, and they are. But the thing is that every time they tell that story, they hear a different meaning in it. So that's why we encourage people to tell stories. And you're very lucky in your life, you've got someone that you can share your grief with. But people become aware over time. I don't want to keep talking about this topic. These people who are in my life, because I don't want to kind of be burdening them. And that's often why counselling is kind of, I suppose, an alternative way of looking at it. So you might come and talk to somebody whose job it is to listen to that story and who can help you make sense of it. And then it's very active. We used to think that grief washed over us, but in fact, we realise now that people make choices from day one. For example, they choose whether they're going to have a private or a public funeral. They choose whether they're going to be awake at home. They choose whether they're going to have, you know, what kind of funeral they're going to have, whether they're going to have in one's mind, you know, what person is dressed in if they're laid out. There's lots of choice to make all the time about grief. And that's really important because it is, choice is really important. So one thing that my talk, I just want to finish up these few slides. So I guess I want to talk about what do I think the essential needs of the bereaved person is. I've said it already, I'm going to say it again. The need for time is really, really important. Give yourself time. Take your time. Don't be rushing through your grief. It has a life of its own, and it will come to a natural. It will reduce gradually over time, the intense nature of it. Don't allow yourself to be judged. I always feel sorry for people when they're grieving, because we all live our lives in private. We don't get judged by other people in the public limelight. But I often think that when you're grieving, it's like living in a goldfish bowl, because everyone's watching how you are. Are you doing it this way? Are you going to the grave? Are you not going to the grave? Are you like, you know, did you go back to work? Did you not go back to work? So I think being around one or two people who are not judgmental, who don't be telling you, you know, do it this way or that way, that's really helpful. The need to make sense, which I know I've kind of emphasized already. The need to believe in yourself. You know, you've got through things in the past, so be hopeful. Like one of the things we really try and do here, I think, is really engender hope in people, that they can be somewhat confident that things will get better and nothing lasts forever, and grief changed as well. And the need to continue the bond with the person who died in whatever way makes sense to you. So how do you make, you know, what way does that work for you? And then, so 5 key takeaways from my talk today is that our level of attachment to the person who died is the primary influence on how much we grieve. So, you know, it's very hard to imagine that you love somebody a lot and suddenly they're no longer in your life physically. That takes time, and we have to give ourselves that time. Your grief is unique and individual to you, that there is, you know, it's completely your grief. You know about it and you know how to manage it, and be okay about that. Be kind of confident about that. There's no right way to grieve as long as you don't harm yourself or anyone else. So, you know, if you feel like play music at 2 o'clock in the morning because it gets you through the night, that's grand as long as you're not upsetting anybody else in your life. So don't be too strict about the rules around grief as long as you're not harming yourself and you're not harming anybody else. All emotions are normal in grief depending on when they occur, including the ones that you might be reluctant to share, like you might be relieved the person has died. And it might be hard to say that because you can't really, you'd be afraid somebody will misinterpret it, and you know, and they might. So I think it's just to realise for yourself that all emotions are normal in grief, and that grief changes over time. It doesn't stay the same. It's a very evolving picture. The grief stays the same, but your life goes around it. And that's what happens to people all the time. And sometimes people get guilty about saying, I must have really loved them enough because they're quite, how am I getting to be okay about this? But you might be okay today and you come back tomorrow with throes of grief. There's no right way to be. But gradually over time, you hope that things will get a bit easier and that you'll be aware of that. And I'm going to finish with this slide, because you probably know from hearing me talking now that we're really kind of trying to encourage people to look at how they can continue to bond with somebody if they choose. See, if you choose. So things like rituals, places, photos and objects, values or dreams, activities that the person loved. The relationship would change, but maintain connections after loss is healthy and allowed. And I really believe that. You don't have to do it, but if it works for you and it's helpful, it's supportive. Of all the things I've done in grief and loss, counselling and therapy over the last 20 or 30 years, this has been the most influential. This idea that if you choose to, you can still have a relationship with the person who died because you carry them with you in your heart. And that's been really powerful in terms of how people grieve and how people manage their grief. So that's it. I'm going to stop talking there and just open it and let Mary Kate take over. If that's okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Helen. And this is just the last slide. thanking you for listening, and thank you so much, Helen. I'm now going to stop the recording. Okay, so I'm just going to do that now.